Hey guys, so last video I reviewed the Udon Manga Classics edition of Jane Eyre, spoiler free. I mostly just talked about the creative team and how much respect I have for their adaptation process and how much I enjoyed the book overall. And this is going to be our super spoiler review. But first, I want to mention something that has occurred to me that I think is important before you all check out. So it's kind of been hip of late to make Tom King roast videos because he's been writing Batman for a while. He had a Batman Catwoman wedding that turned out to be fake news that last year, and he's been stretching that out. And people are making fun of him because he keeps messing up classic characters people love and turning them into murderers and stuff. And I have not been reading Tom King or new superhero books for the past year, and I'm so happy I'm reading library books instead. Something I heard that kind of just I had a hard time wrapping my head around it is Tom King saying that his plan after the wedding between Batman and Catwoman didn't happen was he had a 100-issue arc in mind, telling the grand epic story of Batman marrying Catwoman. I started thinking, wait a second, 100 issues? What is 100 issues really? I need my astronomy 101 teacher to come back and take all the whole class out to the football field and send one of my classmates to the opposite end of the football field to show how far Pluto is from Earth and the Sun. Because it's almost hard to wrap your mind around that. So let's try to explain what the heck is wrong with Tom King and why Jane Eyre is closer to being a better Batman comic book than Tom King's Batman. So 100 issues of Batman. They just released the 1,000th issue of Detective Comics. So your plan, Tom King, was to have something that was the length of 1/10 of every detective comic published since the 1930s. And not even all of them are about Batman. You were going to devote that to one subplot of Batman marrying Catwoman. 100 comic books, if they're 24 pages each, that's going to be what, 2,400 pages or 20 trade paperbacks? So a stack about this high for me to see when Batman finally gets to marry Catwoman. That's how long I'm supposed to stay invested. Now, Tom, I love Batman, but hear me out. Maybe the story of Batman getting jilted at the altar like a soy boy doesn't need this much a thick pack of books to tell that story. Maybe the love story of Batman and Catwoman is pretty simple, and you can kind of get it down to, I don't know, at least that maybe Batman is less complicated than Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So, all that to say, Jane Eyre, congratulations. You're closer to being a more fun Batman comic than Tom King. Got him! All right. I'm really loving the library books. Everyone should try this. I have one more important thought before I go into all the crazy tangents over all my crazy thoughts about this book. You should really check out The Andrew Klavan Show. It's a conservative podcast. He's a Hollywood writer. He's written some, big New York Times bestselling books. He's written some Hollywood movies. So he has a really thoughtful perspective on the arts and the culture. So even if you say, oh, I don't want to listen to a conservative political commentator, listen to Andrew Klavan for his comments on art, because I think he's one of the most thoughtful voices on what the arts mean. So something that Andrew Klavan has talked about is sort of an in-house debate in conservative political circles, where some conservatives do not like the Romantics, and Charlotte Bronte is one of the Romantics. And their argument is, well, basically the Romantics put all their emphasis on emotion, and what does your heart feel like? And the consequence of that is now everybody doesn't care about logic or reason. They all care about feelings. Whatever I want to be real, that's what's real. And so Andrew Klavan defends the Romantics. And basically his argument is that the Romantics weren't saying that the emotions overpower reason. The Romantics' argument is that human emotion is a true part of lived human experience, that it matters. And a marriage deprived of love is a kind of is a sham of marriage. And I think if you look at a lot of the classic authors, like Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility is literally this. A lot of the Romantics would write about the importance of emotions while also kind of confirming that your reason needs to master your emotions. Your emotions are the servant. Your reason is the head of the household. And so, yes, you acknowledge your emotions, feel your emotions, relish, the joy and the love of marriage, but don't let that overcome common sense. And that's definitely a vibe throughout Jane Eyre. The theme of Jane Eyre because it's a romantic novel, is the importance of feeling in a relationship, in addition to self-control and common sense, as a guiding principle you need to escape poverty. So with that, let's flip in. Good job on teaching kids how to read manga. Great start. So Jane Eyre has a problem. Her parents are dead, and she's adopted by her aunt, who doesn't really look at her as a real part of the family. And all of her cousins are bullying. John is especially bullying, and Jane Eyre experiences injustice. John will bully her and start a fight. She'll fight back, and then only Jane Eyre will get in trouble for fighting because her aunt just doesn't treat her like she would one of her own children. So this is Harry Potter with the Dursleys. This is Cinderella. This is every you've been adopted by someone who doesn't love you the way your parents does story. But immediately we see that Jane Eyre is feisty. Jane Eyre stands up for herself. Jane Eyre will, have caustic comments and push back. But her problem is that Jane Eyre doesn't know how to control her emotions when she is subjected to injustice. So she'll be sent to her room, and then she'll freak out and cry and scream, and this will be used as further evidence that she's a naughty child. So she's very firm, she's very independent, she's very strong-willed, but she's not controlling her emotions, and this is making her situation harder than it has to be. Now, during this time, one of the maids of the house is kind of a foreshadowing of what comes later. She'll sing Christian hymns to her. I tried to Google the hymn she was singing, and all I found was Charlotte Bronte, but it's clearly got a Christian aspect of, like the Lord takes care of the orphan child. So the maid is sort of foreshadowing the path that Jane Eyre needs to take to be able to overcome this difficult situation she had. She's from a rich family, but without parents, she's effectively destitute, and she's effectively dependent on a family that hates her. I think a lot of the authors of this time period were completely fascinated with Christianity and British culture. And one of the things they were interested in is what does it mean to be a believer in our culture, and how does that sort of butt up against what it means to be English? And you'll see this in Dickens, you'll see this a little bit in Austen. That's a continuous theme throughout this book, and good on the comic adaptation team for bringing that out explicitly, because if you didn't have like the Christian subtext to this, none of what Jane Eyre is doing would make sense. So Mr. Brocklehurst is the treasurer of an orphan girls' school for like the orphan girls of genteel families. And Mr. Brocklehurst kind of represents a sort of self-sacrificing, sort of puritanical denial of the emotions and one's feelings. And his argument is, we are preparing these girls for a hard life. There is no point in pampering them, because if they're pampered and spoiled, then when they go out into the real world, they're going to be shocked. They're not going to be ready to deal with the difficulties of life. But his problem is that he so overemphasizes difficulty and struggle and endurance that he has no feeling. So he asks her about hell. Do you know where the wicked go after death? They go to hell. And he just assumes that she's going to hell because her aunt tells him he's a wicked child. So he says, well, what do you do to keep out of hell? And she says, I must keep in good health and not die, because she's precocious. And she actually earns a smile from him for that. But what's interesting about this is he's talking about hell without any of the context of what a sinner must do. His emphasis is only on external behaviors and sin, and no emphasis whatsoever on the gospel. This will be important. So Jane Eyre, this is a great example of Jane Eyre being not in control of her emotions. So when she feels angry at her aunt, she will tell her aunt that she hates her directly and that she never wants to see her again. What Jane has to learn is how to direct her independent spirit, which is the challenge she faces at the girls' school. So Miss Temple serves her sweet teacher, and she sees a girl who is punished unfairly. Even though she answers all the questions right, she gets hit with a stick because her hands aren't washed, and she couldn't help it. So this is Helen Burns. Helen Burns is a little older than Jane Eyre, and Jane is interested in why Helen acts the way she does, because Jane's response would be to throw a tantrum, to get revenge, to sort of announce to the world how much she hates the people who are unfair to her. And Helen offers her a different perspective. Cruel, not at all. She is severe. She dislikes my faults. If I were in your place, I should dislike her. I should resist her. If she struck me with a rod, I should get it from her hand and break it under her nose. And Helen says, it would be your duty to bear it if you could not avoid it. It is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what it is your fate to bear. Besides, the Bible bids us return evil good for evil. Do not judge by appearances. I'm careless. I forget rules and never keep things in order, and I read when I ought to be studying. Miss Scatcherd is only trying to help me become a better person, but she's being cruel to you. I feel like I must dislike those who dislike me for no reason. Burns responds, heathens and savage tribes hold that doctrine, but Christians and civilized nations disown it. Follow instead the words of Christ. Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to those that hate you and despitefully use you. And Jane Eyre rejects this. Her attitude is, you get me, I'm going to get you back twice as much. And Helen Burns is offering a completely different worldview to what she's used to. Over time, Jane has to learn the wisdom in Helen's perspective, while still remaining the same kind of independent, strong-willed young lady she is. So Mr. Brocklehurst shows up, and it's kind of established that he's a bit of a hypocrite. He fixates on like minor things, like that girl has curly hair. Well, her hair is naturally curly. Well, that just because her hair is naturally curly, that doesn't mean she should have curly hair. But his wives are very sumptuously. His wife and his daughters are very sumptuously dressed. He doesn't keep his household in the same order that he wants the school to be kept. And when Jane accidentally breaks her slate, he humiliates her. Because her aunt accused her of lying, he has her stand in front of the class and, without any evidence, accuses her of lying in front of everyone. And this is like a shocking thing for her. So this is a bit of like a moment where you might like bounce off this and say, what the heck's going on? So for Jane, this is a really big deal to be called a liar in front of all of the children. And the children might actually ostracize her for this, which is weird because we're almost used to like everybody being a liar today. Like, you lie 6 times a day. What's so weird about being called a liar? But for them, it was almost like, this is the worst possible thing that could, a stain on your character was like the worst possible thing that could happen to you. So she has to take Helen Burns' advice. She has to endure it patiently for as long as she can. And then she breaks down and cries when no one is there. And Helen comes to comfort her. And pretty much what this establishes is the importance of due process. Her teacher understands that if you're accused of something, you have a chance to exonerate yourself, you have a chance to give evidence. She endures the suffering for now and later gets exonerated because her teacher investigates it and finds out that there wasn't a basis for the accusation. Now, of course, what happens is Helen Burns dies. And this is actually probably based on something that happened to Charlotte Bronte's own older sisters. 2 of her sisters died in a boarding school of illnesses. So when Helen dies, and dies true to her faith and her calling, this obviously has an effect on Jane Eyre because Helen has been her comforter in difficult times. Now she needs to understand she has to adopt Helen's perspective in order to endure these things alone. So all of Jane Eyre's childhood is about establishing her moral character. And then when she's grown up, it becomes about the testing of her moral character. So she grows up, she becomes a governess for a wealthy family. By the way, I really love how Grace Poole has like this wild, crazy hair. It's a great way of visually establishing her character. But as a governess, she's going to care for Adele. This is going to be important. So Adele is a little French girl. The master of the house, Mr. Rochester, has brought her from France. She may or may not be a bastard child he had with an illicit affair with a French woman. That's not clearly established. But for some reason, he's caring for Adele in his home. But he's never at the house, and he's kind of a mysterious character. He's considered a man of good character. He's considered intelligent and very well liked and loved by his staff, but he's a bit of a bizarre person in that they can never tell whether he's joking or not. Is he being serious or is he being playful? Is he a warm and good guy, or is he kind of a cold and heartless guy? No one can quite figure him out. One of the other interesting things about these novels is I think that Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte were interested in making the argument that women have a full intellectual and emotional internal life. At a time where almost no one was educated. So people will say, oh, well, why did people assume girls couldn't be educated back then? Well, because almost no one was educated. If almost no boys and men are getting educated, why would you assume that every girl and woman should be educated? Almost everyone was illiterate. So what a book like this does is it shows you that girls can think through the problems of life internally, and that's a rich intellectual discipline. So my first 3 months at Thornfield passed smoothly. Still, my restless nature made me discontent with this peaceful situation. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They suffer from restraint and stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. So the entire time that we see Jane Eyre as a grown-up, she's very restrained, she's very calm, composed, logical, and direct. But the entire time she's thinking about the importance of her emotions still. So she's done it. She has learned to, she has this vivacious, direct, blunt personality. She's learned how to control that. She meets a mysterious man on the road, and what I love about Jane Eyre is she is this very, she's a woman with these very strong personality, this very strong personality to her. She's very independent and direct, but she's still a girl. Like, she doesn't know how to take care of horses. So when she offers to help the mysterious man, she doesn't know how to like get close to his horse or what to do. So in the end, she helps the rider get to his horse, and he goes to the house. And of course, the mysterious stranger is really, it was really Mr. Rochester the whole time. And immediately we start getting this sort of romantic, somewhat romantic back and forth between them, where it's all about, they're both intellectuals. So as a governess, Jane is very well educated. She's more educated than just like the common little household servant. She is the child of lords and ladies, but she's an employee. So there's sort of this difficult thing where she's part of the paid staff. But we can talk to her like an educated person, and she actually comes from a good family. Therefore, people want to make conversation with her. And Rochester's always like feeling her out, trying to like see how smart she is, see if she's great. I'm gonna do another take. I had bookmarks falling out. I had vacuum cleaners going off. All right, let's try this again. So, during this back and forth between Jane and Mr. Rochester, one of the things I love about this book is how many like alternate takes they have on the themes, and these all start sort of wrapping over one another. So this is this really interesting little statement about art, where he looks at her drawings and wonders if she did copies of a master. No, from my head. For a schoolgirl, your paintings are very peculiar. Are you satisfied with the result of your labors? Far from it. I am tormented by the contrast between my ideas and my handiwork. In each case, I imagine something which I was powerless to realize. So she is a talented artist, but she's frustrated with the quality. But Rochester sees potential in that. So this entire time, this is a really interesting little statement about being frustrated with your art and not feeling like it's quite up to what you expect it to be. But it's also a statement about intellectual pursuits, and he's fascinated by her intellectual pursuits and her accomplishments. So something we've seen established about Jane Eyre is she has this sort of blunt personality. She likes to tell you what she thinks. So Rochester asks her, "Do you think me handsome?" "No, sir." That's great. Great comedic understatement. So she just flat out says, "No, you're not handsome." And we see Rochester's kind of odd personality in the way he reacts to things. And I think the manga art helps with this a lot. So he will be playful. He'll kind of like try to tease answers out of her. Sometimes he'll act like he's hurt and offended and then go back to being calm and composed again. And what this is showing is that she doesn't understand him yet. She's interested in Mr. Rochester, but she hasn't figured this guy out. And this is before she has any romantic feelings towards him whatsoever. Later, there are some mysterious goings-ons in the house, and it's kind of like a really cool mystery aspect to it. Someone seems to be setting things on fire or doing damage, and Jane Eyre, because she's smart, because she sees a problem, she pays attention to what's going on in the world, she spots a fire and she puts it out and essentially saves Mr. Rochester. And he takes this opportunity to kind of pay her a really high compliment. "Strike delight to my very inmost heart for nothing. My cherished preserver, good night." Now, it's not clear to me whether he's coming on to her and asking her to sleep with him. I doubt it, but he pays her this really high compliment. And then when she leaves, this is like a great little manga convention where they give him like the two silly Billy faces. But the point is that she's sort of put two and two together, that he said this really serious thing and now it's over. Now it's kind of awkward. Oopsie. How does she feel about him? How does he feel about her? And for the first time in her life, she starts having her heart thumped. She starts feeling like this stirring of emotion because she's now looking at him in a different way. At first, she looked at him as like a weird employer, a smart guy. She couldn't really figure out, and the emotion kind of hits her all at once. So for the rest of the time now, Jane has to struggle between her intelligence, her understanding of her situation, and how she feels. She knows in her head it's dumb for me as an employee to expect to end up with the master of the house. He is at a much higher social station than I am. Therefore, I need to control this emotion of my heart because it's a silly emotion. It can never be realized. It's a dream that won't work out. But she can't help how she feels, and she's blushing like a shoujo girl. I thought this was kind of interesting because maybe this underscores something about maybe the limits of the drawing. So as she's sort of grappling with how unrealistic her crush on Mr. Rochester is, she draws a drawing of herself plain, kind of like making all of her features, her ugly features, prominent, and then draws a portrait of Miss Blanche that's lovely and idyllic. And she shows herself these to say, I never will have a chance with Mr. Rochester. Why would he ever look at me when he's got her? So she's being self-critical, essentially trying to kill the emotion that she thinks is foolish. Now, the reason I mark this is she actually is very pretty, and the drawing acknowledges that. Maybe it's because they wanted a manga style, they prettied her up, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether in the original book she's supposed to be ugly or whether she's a plain girl with a pretty aspect to her, where if you look at yourself in the mirror, maybe you see the ugly aspects of your face, but she's clearly a very pretty girl, and she's sort of bagging on herself a little bit. So as Mr. Rochester begins to court Miss Blanche, she's very rich, she's very beautiful, she's got this great over-the-top dress and hairdo, but she's very caustic. She'll say petty things about Adele. She'll say nasty things about governesses in general within earshot of Jane Eyre, who's invited to the events. I love this little visual gag where she's grumpy about the gypsy's fortune telling and she's out of sorts, so they just have the book upside down. Great little visual reinforcement of how upset she is. Now this gypsy, almost immediately I guess that this is Mr. Rochester in disguise. He has them come in and he tells the girls who they secretly admire and kind of gets in their heads. And what he's doing when Jane comes is he's trying to figure her out. What he likes about Jane is that she's forthright. He'll ask her a question and she'll give him an honest answer. She'll be informal and direct with him without like flattering him. So he's trying to figure out secretly if she really likes him. Now, he knows that and he tries to tease it out of her. So basically the problem for both of them is trying to figure out the other person. Jane knows he's this intelligent, rich, fascinating individual, but she can't figure him out because of the odd way he behaves sometimes. He knows that she's this very frank, forthright, very young girl. He's 20 years older than her. But he doesn't even know if she likes him yet, or he suspects, but she's not willing to say. Something that's been established by family members of Mr. Rochester is because he was the younger boy in the household, he got set down on a bad path in life because it was never expected that he would inherit. Then his older brother dies and he does get to inherit. And a lot of this is foreshadowing for something important later. But the problem for Mr. Rochester is, can you undo something bad that happened to you early in your life? Can you undo that mistake? Can you live your life normally after that? And this parallels Jane's problem. Jane's actually in a worse situation because she was an orphan and is effectively destitute. But something has happened in Rochester's life, which he believes has sort of spoiled the prospects for the rest of his life. Because of this, he becomes moody. So he'll occasionally be like the warm, charming person he normally is. And then as he becomes sort of depressed, he'll become more reserved and cold and calculating about things. Eventually, Jane receives some correspondence from her aunt asking her to come see her. And in this kind of teasing way, Mr. Rochester lets her know he doesn't really want her to go. He wants her to come back, but finally he lets her go. And what is important about this is the closure on the childhood part of Jane Eyre's life. As a child, her biggest problem was her aunt was unjust to her and cruel to her and lied about her. Now that she's learned from Helen Burns, Jane Eyre comes back, and even though she doesn't love her aunt, they don't really see each other as family in any way, she does want to be reconciled to her aunt. So it's sort of like she's able to close the book on this sad part of her life, grow and move on from that. And it's kind of underscored that of all the children, Jane Eyre has worked out the best. Like, one of her sisters is kind of a caustic and nasty to people. One is a nice little, Catholic nun girl, but she's too reserved and she doesn't really interact with people at all. John committed suicide. And Jane's kind of like figured out a direction for her life in a way that none of the others have. I also noticed there's like a really interesting recurring mention of Roman Catholicism throughout this, which is a little odd because I think that Charlotte Bronte and most English people were Protestant. So it was just something I noticed. So after Jane Eyre is able to overcome the problem of her resentment towards her aunt, it's sort of like now she's free and she can sort of move on with her life. So she sort of directly tells Mr. Rochester that I'm a girl with feelings. If you marry Miss Blanche, I can't just be around here as a servant because I love you. She's able to directly tell him her problem. And this is a continuation of the earlier theme. The earlier theme was that women experience emotion just like men. She's now able to express to Mr. Rochester that she has feelings for him, and she's not a little toy. She can't just banish these feelings. Once that's admitted, he's able to kiss her. This is the thing he's been trying to tease out of her the entire time. So after Mr. Rochester has finally kissed her, which might be like an addition of the manga to make it a bit more romantic, Jane is still surprised at the idea that he loves her because she's had this one-sided crush this entire time. You, strange, unearthly, poor, and obscure, I love you as my own flesh, accept me as your husband. What? Me? So what clearly has happened is she has impressed Mr. Rochester with her intelligence, her character, her honesty, which is what Miss Blanche does not have. So it seems like they're going to have like this really sweet honeymoon moment, right? Like this is about the point where in maybe, Pride and Prejudice, we'd be getting ready for the wedding bells, we'd be getting ready for the happily ever after, but we're not done. There are still some unanswered questions. We know that Jane has sort of reached this moral point where she's a worthy wife. She will be a good wife for Mr. Rochester, but we still haven't sort of figured out the mystery of Mr. Rochester and the house. Now, something gets underscored by Mrs. Thornside or whatever, but one of his relations, sort of bluntly states, I hope all will be right in the end, but you cannot be too careful. Gentlemen in his station are not accustomed to marrying their governesses. Equality of position and fortune is often advisable in marriage. So romance is working out, the feelings are working out, the love is there, but there are still some practical problems between Jane and Mr. Rochester. Will it all work out? Now, this is something that might have been added by the manga team, but the mystery of what the heck is going on in the house, why do these bizarre accidents keep happening, gets reinforced when she sees this sort of mysterious corpse-like bride wandering around, and it's almost like a phantom premonition of sorts. What I really love is there's a lot of mention of the supernatural and elves and fairyland, but you never see it directly. It's almost like she knows that these things are make-believe, yet she can't overcome the sense that maybe these supernatural things are out there and are affecting them. So they go and they have their big, beautiful marriage, but right before they can say I do, a dramatic revelation occurs. And I can't stress this enough. Spoiler, 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 go read Jane Eyre. Mr. Rochester is already married. He's married to a mad woman. She's been the person the entire time who's been wandering around the house, breaking stuff and setting things on fire. And it was a great little mystery, too, because the entire time I kept thinking, oh, well, it's got to be Grace Poole because she's kind of weird and got this erratic hair. That was just a red herring. So because Rochester is married to a mad woman who effectively growls and bites like a wolf, he will never have a real marriage. She can't give him children. So even though he knew it would be bigamy, he wanted to marry Jane and try to keep his old wife in secret. But the truth got revealed, unfortunately. So there is no way for them to be legally married in Britain. Now comes a temptation. So Jane has established a character. She's the kind of person who could be a great wife to Mr. Rochester. She sincerely loves him with all her heart. The temptation he offers her is, come with me to France, and we will be married in France. And she says no. He's offering her love. He's offering her wealth and comfort and security for the rest of her life. And she has to say no, because to do that would be to be his mistress. And she cannot morally accept being his mistress. She wants to be his true legal wife. Now, she has to say no more than once to him because he's persistent. And kind of what the two and two she puts together is she can't really stay here because he loves her, she loves him. There's no way they're going to be able to resist that temptation. So she just leaves, flat out leaves, and becomes destitute because of it, ends up homeless because of her conviction. Now, the reason this is important is why does this moral decision make sense? It makes sense because Jane Eyre has been inculcated by her friendship with Helen Burns that reliance on Christ is what she needs to endure the suffering of life, and it's foolish to not endure suffering. Therefore, because of this conviction, she's willing to throw away every creature comfort of wealth and happiness and sex in the name of being true to her moral principles. That's amazing. As she wanders the countryside, she eventually kind of like collapses right outside of this little pastor's home. And his name is St. John, and he lives there with his two sisters. And she discovers, gasp, these are my cousins. So a problem for Jane this whole time is she's had no true family. And in the midst of this catastrophe, something wonderful, she's found her long lost cousins. And it seems like she's finally going to have her family. She gets to teach little, like poor farmers' kids who are illiterate, and things are going great. Things are going great for her. But she's sort of decided that she doesn't want to be married anymore. She's happy now as she is. She suspects that St. John loves Rosamond Oliver, but St. John offers a completely different, he almost represents the complete opposite worldview, or a completely opposite idea to Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester is a little immature. He's very intelligent and romantic and charming and wins her heart. St. John is a lot more cold, calculating, rational, and he has a big vision for his life. He wants to go to India and be a missionary to the Indians. And he suggests to Jane, even though she thinks that, oh, well, he must love Rosamond Oliver, he says, no, she's not going to be a good missionary's wife. You, Jane, you would be a good missionary wife. Marrying your cousin, actually, I guess that was a lot more normal back then because it was a smaller agrarian culture. So he proposes marrying Jane. And she has to think about it because she genuinely respects St. John. She believes in his mission. What's interesting about this is a completely different temptation. Earlier, Jane was being tempted by, if you do something you know is wrong, you will get wealth and happiness and sex and all this great stuff. Now she's being tempted by the idea that maybe this is what God wants. So I won't love him. He won't really love me. It'll be just a cold, calculated, logical marriage without any emotion to it. But maybe if we do it, it'll be God's will, and we'll do this grand good work. And what she realizes is, it's really gut-wrenching because she realizes if she goes to India, she will probably die an early death because of the hard conditions. But her conclusion is that she cannot marry someone just for the cold, hard logic of it, that we're suitable for each other. Her thoughts and her emotions and her heart do matter. And so this is the second time she has to say no. Now she has to say no to someone she genuinely respects as a godly man. And because she's a godly woman, it just makes it hard for her. But I think she makes the right decision. She realizes that if she kills this about herself, she will be denying something that's true about her internal life and her internal heart. Fantastic. So throughout this entire book, the supernatural has been a subtle subtext. So they mention fairies, they mention, urban legends about monsters on the road, and Jane has been grappling with this moral dilemma. Will she marry a man who she might be a good fit for, but she doesn't really love? So she gets some counsel from her cousins, and they kind of agree, yeah, we don't want you to die in India. That we love you, we don't want you dead. And what she kind of puts two and two together is that while praying to God, please show me the way, I don't know what to do, she hears a voice in her mind. And this is seemingly something supernatural, just out of nowhere. And she's convinced that this isn't witchcraft. This must be an answer to my prayer. She believes she hears the voice of Mr. Rochester, and she takes that as her answer that Mr. Rochester needs my help, I need to go back to him. Now, this is the second time that Jane has realized she has unfinished business. First, she went back to her aunt and sought reconciliation. She loved Mr. Rochester. She had to leave him, but she doesn't know what has become of him. She has to go back and see what's become of the man she loves. In her absence, tragedy has befallen Mr. Rochester. His mad wife set fire to the house. He tried to save her. The mad wife killed herself, and in the fire, he becomes blind and loses one of his hands. So Rochester sees this as divine punishment for his sins. And because of that, he's now repentant, and he's sort of resigned himself to suffering and loneliness. Now that she comes back to him, this is really important. Now she realizes that someone who's been fiercely independent before has been humbled and is in a difficult situation now and will actually need her help. So she's going to have to do work and take care of him if she gets married to him. But what's important to her is she still loves this man, and they can now be mutually dependent on one another. Originally, he loved her when she was a penniless governess. She's now inherited a sizable fortune of her own. She's completely independent. Yet, because she loves Mr. Rochester, she's now willing to be in a situation where She will care for him and he will care for her, and it's not a one-sided relationship. Really something. So he asked her, "Do you really love me? To the finest fiber of my nature, sir. Of late I acknowledge the hand of God in my doom and have learned repentance and remorse. 4 nights ago I prayed to God that you be returned to me and called out your name, and now my prayer is answered." So there's the supernatural element being fulfilled. Mr. Rochester's problem throughout the entire first part of the book is he was older than Jane, he was intelligent, he was rich, but he wasn't prepared for marriage, and he was willing to compromise his morals in the name of getting what he wanted, his love with Jane. Because of the suffering he's now endured, he's learned that the marriage to Jane needs to be it needs to honor God, and it needs to honor Jane as a part. Jane and her conviction as part of the marriage. Because he's learned that, he is now ready to marry Jane. So she was ready this whole time. It got stripped away from her, and at last everything works out. Happy wedding bells. Everything works great. I love this little bit. Adele, the French girl, as she grew, a sound English education corrected, in great measure, her French defects. She became pleasing, good-tempered, and well-principled. This is so British. I love it. And look, she has a baby, and John regains some of his sight. It's a happy ending. Wedding bells. This is great. All right. So, character endures suffering. Character learns to control her emotion. Character thinks through her problems. Character realizes that cold, hard logic isn't the only thing in life, but because she governs her emotion, she's able to have it work out in the end. She finds the opportunity. She gets what she wanted. Fantastic. Maybe like as a closing thought, I really enjoy Jordan Peterson lectures, but one of the things I actually dislike about Jordan Peterson is I think he maybe overemphasizes suffering in narrative. He'll look at the Bible and he'll talk about like the suffering of the characters and enduring suffering, which is important. That's a theme throughout Jane Eyre. But an additional theme is not just enduring suffering, but finding hope in spite of suffering in something greater than yourself. And that becomes the thing that gives Jane Eyre her hope and her endurance through all of her troubles. Fantastic book. I loved it. I'm going to go get the original. That's it. So many tangents. I'm number one Marmaduke fan. Love you guys. Like, comment, subscribe. Catch you later. Adele...